Hey, cool. I feel famous. That's awesome.
Awesome. Margaret? Margaret?
Does it say something on this? Why do they always do this?
Second six, Margaret.
I've got the question. I got it. What are the things that might go through a sailor's mind that they won't ask for help? And what we learned from our studies is that the #1 reason why sailors will not ask for help is they want to fix it themselves. It's pride.
It's about culture, it's about teamwork. And once I found that in the Navy, it was striking and empowering and galvanizing.
The longer you spend on these ships, the more you see that the crew, the people who man them, really bring them to life. And then you see that these different systems that drive these incredible machines, it's really just an extension of sailors who are passionate about their work.
To do their job, no matter what it takes to get that job done, that's the minimum standard. If you have something to do and there's a bunch of obstacles in the way, well, you have no choice but to knock them down and get it done.
I don't think our general population appreciates enough what these young men and women are willing to sacrifice.
It is a sacrifice. It can be difficult for many to be gone for that long, yet they serve to support and defend the country. And I don't know that everyone fully appreciates that sacrifice that they make.
The sacrifices that they make, the sacrifices their families make, and really the situations that they put themselves in without blinking an eye is absolutely remarkable. And they don't get the credit because they're very humble.
Every statement post 9/11 was always, thank you for your service. The proper response sometimes is, thank you for your trust.
The sacrifices that service members make go way beyond being away from their families and being in harm's way. It goes to basic human comforts.
The jobs that they are required to do are oftentimes not ones that you and I want to do.
At first, it's a little overwhelming. It's kind of like a maze, and then it goes out to sea, so it's a maze that's rocking a lot. Industrial is definitely the best way to describe it.
It's generally very noisy. We have a lot of machinery going on, so that noise can have an industrial hygiene challenge, which is, the risk of actually suffering hearing loss.
There's the fact that it's a 24-hour operation, so there are almost constantly people coming in and out to go to meals, go to bed, wake up, try to clean the place. Even when I was commanding officer on my ship, it wasn't uncommon that I'd get waken up 5-6 times in the middle of the night and achieve 3.5 hours of sleep.
The scientifically accepted standard is 7 to 9 hours of sleep. The actual question of how much sleep someone is getting is not actually clear.
There's a daily grind to it all, no matter where in the world you are, no matter where you're serving or in what capacity.
Being undermanned is a consistent stressor, constantly working through the process. A very complicated system to get the resources you need is going to be a consistent stressor.
One of the first questions I ask most times is, why join the Navy? The next question you always kind of have to follow that up with is, why'd you stay?
How do we go out there and do that, they ask themselves. And the truth is we're still people, right? Every one of them out there, they're humans. They have failure points, so to speak. When we don't have the resources, I think, is when we're running into trouble.
The last thing they want to convey is that our ships aren't safe. But we have some egregious examples.
Unfortunately, that bright constellation comes together. You have to make a decision in a moment, and you might be compromised, and all of a sudden now you have an incident.
And that should be and is gravely concerning to me, and it should be to the rest of America.
So I was drawn to this idea of trying to think about how we could formalize and clarify a concept of safety that would be useful, because sometimes the way people approach safety is definitely not helpful. One of the ways that many organizations think of safety is, well, safety is the intervals where there are no accidents, then you're safe. Well, that's an interesting concept of safety. It was safe until it failed catastrophically. That is not a helpful concept.
Because we need to look at the entire system and all the contributions of different components to the system. Every accident has hardware failures. There's some kind of system design errors. It usually has humans who didn't behave the way that people expected them to. It usually has managers making poor decisions. We have to understand all of the causal factors, not just find some human to blame it on, and then we're done.
We refer to this as the poor dumb bastard theory. There's always some poor, person down there who was trying to do their job, who couldn't get their whole job done, and things went wrong. And when we find that out, we're going to hold them accountable for it. Now, it turns out there's always somebody who's out of compliance, even if it had almost nothing to do with whether this event actually took place, because we've got a system that's operating under such high stress on an average day, we can't get the whole job done.
They just don't have the folks. They go out longer than they expected to. And that's just asking folks to function at 120% all the time. It's just where we're at. But when you make that a kind of a standard operational tempo, that can be difficult for people, almost impossible to keep up long term.
And, one perspective is it's good to be able to do those things, which is true. And we want to stress people, and we want to put them under those conditions, and we want to test them under those conditions so that they will succeed when the real thing comes. But if you're doing that constantly, you do have this breakdown process over time.
One of the things we try to do with the NTSB is go to the next level. So if somebody made a mistake, people do make mistakes. Okay, why did they make that mistake? Did they receive improper training? Were they fatigued? What are the reasons? Okay, if they were fatigued, why were they fatigued? I oftentimes think that maybe the Swiss cheese or the error chain model is an oversimplification, but it really isn't.
So if you think of a piece of Swiss cheese, there's holes scattered, and you have to line up all those holes just right for that accident to happen. If you rotated or moved one of those slices of cheese, one of those defenses or barriers would be in place and might not have caused that mishap or that accident.
Each layer had an opportunity to stop that mishap, not just the guy or gal down there who flipped the wrong switch, but they could have been not in that position because it was a bad day, it was a busy day. If folks were fatigued, they could have had training or supervision, and the organizational culture maybe had not put them in a situation where they were tired. But at the very least, when we understand safety that way, as having multiple layers, we're not blaming dead service members for making mistakes anymore, because it didn't happen in a vacuum.
And I think that's showcased in some of the safety-related incidents that we've seen with the collisions, 2017. I'm sure we'll get into that.
One of our cruisers, Major Command, ran aground in Yokosuka Harbor. And the first thing we heard was, and nobody can figure out why, because there was nothing wrong with the ship. And so I launched myself as part of the safety investigation, and when we got there, we found that that was true. There was nothing wrong with Antietam. And they ran onto the rocks. The point there was, all right, so we figured out exactly why Antietam ran aground, which was basically a series of interesting decisions about what they were going to do and not do, not acknowledging the fact that the way they were going about doing things would never have been successful that day. At 35 knots of wind, knot and a half of current coming from the port beam on the way that they planned their approach to Anchorage that day. And under those conditions, putting out 2 shots of chain, which was always their plan, and then adding more chain once the ship had stopped moving, was never going to work. Because under those conditions, it takes at least 4 shots of chain to hold the ship in place. But we figured out why they didn't succeed. We figured out why they extended the damage. We came back with a long list of recommendations, and we implemented those into a plan of action of milestones that we vigorously attacked. And sort of perspective of the time was, maybe this is a unicorn. There's some things we can learn, so all right, nobody got hurt. And then just a couple months later, that's when we had the Fitzgerald mishap.
The Fitzgerald was proceeding from an area where they'd been doing exercises the night before and to another area where they were transiting to, and had to cross a fairly busy thoroughfare, and that is the entrance to Tokyo Bay or Tokyo One.
Any high traffic area can be extremely dangerous. Just think about driving down an interstate vice a rural or country road. Interstates, there's a lot more cars. You've got to be careful with what other people are doing. It's the same in the open waterway.
One of the factors in the Fitzgerald was the bridge and Combat Information Center were not communicating well. So in Combat Information Center, the information was supposed to be supporting the bridge in terms of contact management. Other ships in the area weren't doing adequate job in keeping the bridge informed of the danger out there. And there were 3 vessels traveling north on the Fitzgerald's starboard side. They maneuvered to try and avoid these 3 ships, made a particular move that took the Fitzgerald into a collision course with the ACX Crystal. 7 sailors lost their lives.
7 people are dead, and the ship is limping into port, and we're hoping it can get there. And the worst naval mishap in many, many years, particularly in terms of loss of life. So, of course, we're interested. We launched several investigations. They're off and running. They're doing their thing. We're ready to make changes, figure this out, never happen again. And before we could really even get that report and turn it around, John S. McCain.
So the McCain was transiting in the Singapore Strait on their way to a port call in Singapore. They were in the westbound traffic separation scheme. It's essentially a maritime superhighway.
So Strait of Malacca is the busiest waterway in the world. There are 300 accidents there a year. It's kind of like driving down 95 in New Jersey in the rain and you're tired.
You know, I-95 with a bunch of cars together, all going different speeds. And they were overtaking the Alnick MC, which was a tanker, going much slower, going about 9 knots. The McCain was going about 18 knots. As the McCain was approaching and going to overtake the Alnick MC on the Alnick MC's starboard side, the captain wanted to stand up a lee helmsman, which is the person controlling the throttles. On board the McCain, they had a fairly new navigation and control system that controlled both steering and the throttles for the engines. At the time, control of the engines and steering was in the helmsman's position. So when they decided to stand up a lee helmsman, which is a position right next to the helmsman, they had to transfer control of the engines to the lee helmsman positions. And in attempting to do that, there was an inadvertent transfer of the steering over to the lee helmsman position. The crew didn't see that it happened. And so the helmsman, who had been steering, no longer had control and perceived a loss of steering. But now that he no longer had control, the McCain started to slowly creep to port towards the Alnick MC. McCain had 2 throttles, one for the port engine, the starboard engine, port prop, and starboard propeller. And the lee helmsman, who had control of the engines, thought that both engines were ganged, which means connected together. As it turned out, they were not connected. And so when ordered to slow the ship down, he slowed one throttle, the port throttle, leaving the starboard throttle at the speed that they had been going, which created what we call asymmetric thrust, in which there was more thrust on the starboard side. And that increased the rate of turn to port towards the Alnick MC.
One side didn't match with the other, asymmetric thrust, and they started to turn as a result of that thrust. Lots of other confusion involved, but the bottom line was the fact that that happened when they're less than a couple hundred yards from another ship that they'd just overtaken was the reason they ran into the other ship. Which, this time we killed 10 people. So 10 more of my compatriots.
The day went from good to bad in 3 minutes' time. So from the moment that they began trying to shift control of the engines from the helmsman to the lee helmsman to the collision point was about 3 minutes.
So the perspective, this running perspective across 2017 is not the individual ships or the loss of life necessarily, but it was sufficient to drive us to do something different. For the first time, we did look across all the mishaps. And one of the key statements in there is this idea that each of these is representative of all the other mishaps at sea in the last 20 years.
What we're seeing in these small number of sort of extreme cases, the mishaps, is conditions that are more like what combat conditions are, where people are suddenly confronted by things that are unexpected and they have to figure out how to respond quickly. Well, these mishaps are then a clue that we may not be developing a Navy that's going to be really good at the next naval battle, if, God help us, there ever is one.
It requires thinking about the problem in a totally different way. what Kuhn has called a paradigm shift. And the old way of thinking about the problems don't work for the problems today because the problems have changed.
Willpower is not reliable. This isn't about willpower. This isn't about trying harder. You are making mistakes, and they're involuntary.
The ship is an organization, and so the readiness of that organization builds on the readiness of the individuals that make up that organization. And so to have any one of those individuals be less than optimal increases the risk for the entire organization.
There are plenty of ideas out there about what might work best and various approaches like high reliability organizations. And it could be that you can go grab that checklist, hand it to the force and say, if you do this, life will be good. But that's not how things last.
Adding a checklist doesn't solve that problem. And oftentimes, the more layers you overlay on something or a checklist, the less likely the real work, the real safety isn't getting done.
We can't fix the mistakes unless we have honest, accurate assessment. And everyone's afraid. Everyone's so afraid. Just give us an honest, accurate assessment, because if we had that, we could make the necessary changes that we need to go forward.
The breakthrough for us in the force and thinking about this, and perhaps Navy, was this idea that we have to walk a little bit away from this idea of individual causes. So we need to start looking more fundamentally at what are the systemic parts of this that are important, and in a broader system sense, the human system.
Fatigue impacts safety, to put it bluntly and simply. We're trying to get ahead of that so we understand, if you look under the hood, where are we at in terms of sleep and fatigue as a threat to performance, which is a threat to safety.
People have self-reported on a ship generally about 5 to 6 hours a night is what is gotten. And so there's a large volume of scientific work that indicates that that is obviously suboptimal, and this creates both cognitive challenges as well as more general health risks.
What we're finding now is the attention that fatigue is getting focus from all parts of the Navy, and some very important parts that oversee how operations happen. And I think that's going to be a catalyst for addressing it.
One of the many findings of the investigation was that the sailors were reporting not having adequate access to mental health care. It is a direct result of the collisions at sea from 2017. When a person is fatigued, they're not as alert, they're not able to concentrate, they may be more short-tempered, be more prone to depression, anxiety, and none of those things are things you want when you have to make key decisions in a dangerous environment 24/7.
We cannot just stay with some of the old mental models as we approach going to sea and doing it safely and doing it in a very complex environment.
The system is broken, but nobody wants to admit that. What we need is understand what safety critical decisions are they making and what information do they need and how do we design our system to get that information to them.
Ideally, what we should do is we should say, okay, bring the operators in to help us define the use cases, because we need to make sure it supports those actions. Secondly, bring them in to define the information requirements. Bring them in to help us understand how to present that information. Bring them in to iteratively assess the evolving design. Bring them in iteratively to do usability assessments of the system as it becomes more and more mature. And then have them involved in the underway fleet tests. If you have the operators involved, now it fits their mental model, which is an operational model. It's going to be safer, it's going to be more effective, it's going to be more efficient.
This isn't just about the research. This is about how do we connect that to mission accomplishment? How do we make sure that you're more effective in your role? One of the things that's amazing about training and developing folks is they're a fresh set of eyes. And if you have the right culture, they're going to tell you about it. They're going to show it to you and say, that doesn't quite look right. And you get one chance of getting that one right. And making sure that they are a force for good, right? Because that everyone can say no one's too junior to point out a safety violation, but the fundamental piece is, do they feel empowered that they can actually use that voice?
With how technical our systems are, our ships are, there's no way a captain's going to be the most knowledgeable person on any ship about every single system. And the most powerful words, in my opinion, that an officer or a leader can have on a ship or in any organization is, I was wrong. And thank you for pointing that out.
So each one of these has been a get real point. Where do we actually stand versus where do we think we stand? And it's significant enough events to be able to say, all right, so we're gonna invest some time and effort, and we're gonna work cross lanes, because surface force cannot accomplish anything by itself. We depend on Naval Sea Systems Command to develop systems and products. Naval Aviation Systems Command, data science folks as well. So this broad array of people have to become invested in our problem. And, we'd rather it wasn't in this fashion, but to the extent we use this as opportunities to really bear down on gathering those resources and coming up and advertising what we need and actually doing it, that's sort of the springboard.
We have to unstick it. We've invested too much of our resources, of our men and women in service. We have to unstick it.
We need to make sure that they have the resources to give them the absolute best advantage. If we are not safe, nothing else matters.